All right, everyone, can you hear me okay? Awesome. All right. Welcome to week 2 of the HCDE Research Discussion Seminar. Today I get to introduce myself. So I figured if I'm going to ask faculty to come up and give talks on their research, I better be willing to do that for myself as well. So I'm excited to talk to you all today. If you all don't know me, my name is Julie Kientz, professor, also department chair of Human-Centered Design Engineering. It's my 16th year here at UW, and I primarily do research in the space of designing novel computing applications for health, education, and families using human-centered design techniques. So I have a background in computer science, but very, very much into the realm of human-centered design and applying human-centered design methods to make technologies that people actually find useful and usable and actually have the impacts that we hope that they have in the world. So hopefully like many of you. So today I'm going to be talking to you about 3 studies that I've been conducting as part of a larger initiative that I'm a part of. So back in January 2023, I was really excited to have funded the National AI Institute for Inclusive Education, which is funded by the National Science Foundation and the Institute for Educational Sciences. And so this is a 5-year, $20 million institute consisting of about 8 to 12 different universities. People keep moving between universities, so it's always hard to catch. So about 30 to 40 researchers encompassing artificial intelligence researchers, human-centered designers, but as well as learning sciences, speech and communication, and speech-language pathologists. And so we kind of all come together around a common mission. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both the institute and then the project specifically that my students and I have been working on under this institute. So I'm going to talk a bit about a lot of projects, but this is definitely very much a team effort. So I'm excited to have worked with many great people, including Heywan, Ayushi, who's here. Hey, Ayushi. Alea Lewis, so computer science PhD student. And then faculty, James Fogarty, Carol Miller, Hedda Medan-Kaplansky, and Abby Olszewski, who are the 3 of at the bottom on the right are all people from communication and speech and language pathology. So they are the kind of domain experts helping us human-centered designers do this work. So just to give you some background, since you may not be familiar with the domain of speech and communication difficulties, in the United States, about 3.4 million children require speech and language services under the Individuals with Disabilities Act, or IDEA. So this includes people who might be falling behind in their education. They might be having communication difficulties or pronunciation issues. Also things like swallowing issues are things that speech-language pathologists might work with. And so there's professionals, speech-language pathologists, who essentially will work with these children in either school settings or private practice settings to help them address those issues that they might be dealing with. And so these are highly trained professionals. Usually they require master's degrees and a lot of certifications and to maintain certifications. And so these are highly trained individuals. And even though it's a great and wonderful field, many of you might be in this field if you're here, it's a very under-resourced field in terms of the number of speech-language pathologists. And so the number of students who need the help and support of a speech-language pathologist, or an SLP for short, greatly exceeds the amount of SLPs that we have in the United States. And so there's definitely a need here. Also, the pandemic has increased the need. Kids were falling behind during the lockdowns as a result of the pandemic. And so the need for these services has grown quite a bit, especially as a result of that. So the main issue we're trying to address here is thinking about how we can expand the expertise of speech-language pathologists to meet the demand of the kids who need that support. So again, what is an SLP and what do they do? So the American Speech, Language, and Hearing Association, or ASHA, has a definition of a professional who engages in professional practice in the areas of communication and swallowing across the lifespan. So SLPs do work with children and adults. We're primarily focused on children in our work in particular because many of the types of work that SLPs do are early intervention services for kids on the lower end of the spectrum or work within school settings. However, they do work with adults as well. So, but SLPs do kind of 5 different areas. So they do prevention, assessment, diagnosis, and 4 areas. Prevention, assessment, diagnosis, and interventions for speech, language, and communication difficulties. And so sometimes kids will get diagnosed with a specific disability associated with this, but sometimes kids are just having trouble, articulating or communicating certain words, and so they work with a wide range of people regardless of diagnosis. So as I mentioned, I'm involved with this National AI Institute for Exceptional Education. So if you're not familiar with the AI Institutes, I think it started maybe 4 or 5 years ago. The National Science Foundation was recognizing the impact that artificial intelligence would be having on the state of the world, and recognized that these were very large challenges that needed huge teams of interdisciplinary workers. So I actually got pulled into this. The main university hosting the institute I'm involved is the University of Buffalo, but I'm the UW lead on this, and I'm also the lead of the human-centered design work as a part of that. So as I mentioned, $20 million 5-year effort, bringing together interdisciplinary colleagues across the spectrum to sort of think how we can come together collaboratively. And one of the goals of this institute is to do both basic research, so pushing the bounds of like what artificial intelligence and AI and speech and communication can do in terms of basic science, but then also thinking around use-inspired research. So thinking around how we can do research that also will have benefit to society. Now for us in HCDE, that's definitely what we usually do all the time, so it's not a big ask, but there's about 10 to 15 core artificial intelligence researchers who are working on algorithms and like making things more accurate that have never worked with people sometimes in their life. So my job in this institute is to actually kind of connect the people who are thinking about these kind of core artificial intelligence technology algorithms and the people who very much care about the children and the educational experiences and try to bridge that gap. So I'm working on both sides, actually trying to be a communicator across both the artificial intelligence researchers and the educational and learning sciences researchers, and trying to help them understand where their common goals are, how to speak each other's language, and how to collaborate in service of a common goal. So the driving vision for this institute is around kind of 2 application areas. So one is called the AI screener. And so it's the idea that we can use artificial intelligence, automated speech recognition or ASR, or other sorts of automated listening tools to do screening for individuals who might need the support of speech-language pathologists. And then there's a second application space called the AI orchestrator, which is, again, using artificial intelligence to customize interventions and assessments for kids who have already been identified as needing early intervention services or some sort of speech-language supports, and making sure that they get matched with the right types of supports. And so the AI researchers on our team very much like to develop these pipelines, so they have developed this graphic that kind of represents this idea around the AI screener. So targeting kids at daycare, preschool age, around like ages 3 to 5. Right now, a lot of kids who might need the support of speech-language pathologists are not currently identified, and they might get missed, as well as other kids might also be over-diagnosed or so one of the approaches is sort of, can we use AI-based tools to listen to every child in every space and see if they need the support of speech-language pathologists with a universal approach. Then we sort of identify which children might need to have further evaluation and determine eligibility for services. So we are not touching that process at all. The process of taking a child, having them assessed, and making sure that they are eligible for services, things like your insurance might pay for, or schools might cover. That is a really well-regulated process that very much needs human intervention, and so we are not thinking about AI in this space at all. However, once they've gone through that evaluation and determination of services, then we're sort of thinking about how to support speech-language pathologists in matching the right types of interventions, the right materials, and assessing them for where they might need to be to sort of deliver these types of interventions. And so that's what the AI orchestrator is sort of this customized AI-based approach to this. So the AI orchestrator, the way I've had it described, is kind of like Netflix. And so when you go to Netflix, you might have your menu of all the things you might want to watch. And some of it is sort of existing content, the movies that you might want to stream because they've been made by the movie industries or other sorts of things. But then Netflix decided they need to develop their own content as well, too. So they start to develop some of their own things. So we're, within the AI orchestrator, both sort of delivering existing best practices or evidence-based approaches, as well as developing some of our own novel interventions that we might be delivering within the AI orchestrator system. Now, you might be wondering what the AI orchestrator might look like. Is this a dashboard? Is it Netflix? Is it on a screen? We don't know yet. That's one of the things we're trying to figure out. on both what does the AI screener look like and what does the AI orchestrator look like. What form factors does it take? Is the AI screener a robot that sits in a classroom that kids talk to? Is it just microphones that are over around? Is it an app? We're still trying to determine kind of what those form factors are. And so this is one of the fun things about this project is that it was kind of very highly put into these vision scenarios without necessarily all the need for us to have figured all these things out. So within this 5-year period, we're just trying to figure out what those things should look like. So as I mentioned, I'm the human-centered design lead. So there's like 8 different thrusts. There's like improving automated speech recognition and improving algorithms. There's like multimodal interaction. There's also thinking about kind of developing some of the speech and language communication things that are being led by the learning sciences. And so there's about 7 different components of the Institute, and I'm leading the human-centered design thrust. And so our goals for this work are to assure that the AI screener and the AI orchestrator are acceptable, usable, and useful to SLPs and the kids that they serve, as well as the teachers, parents, and other stakeholders within the ecosystem of working with children with speech-language disabilities or difficulties. And then also thinking about new research questions around human-AI interaction. So there's a lot of work on AI is so new. Kids are learning, how do kids interact with AI? How do they think about AI? So what are the research questions around human-AI interaction, so specifically around kids and exceptional education? Also thinking about new methodologies. So one of the things that human-centered design researchers think about is how can we engage with different stakeholders in new ways? And so looking at kind of new methods. And then thinking about the kind of human constraints to guide the technology innovation. So this is me kind of coming back to some of the more technical people who are pushing on new algorithms and new approaches to say that, you know what, a 67% accuracy is not going to work in this case because the teachers will never trust it. So I'm kind of asking and answering some of those questions and delivering some of those constraints and guidelines back to the technical team. So I'm not going to. We've got a bunch of quick things in here, so I'm not going to go over this in too much. But kind of thinking around, the types of research questions that my team is interested in are the types of things you might be interested in if you're doing a human-centered design project as well. So yeah, what are the opportunities, needs, challenges, ethical concerns around these different tools that are being proposed by the technologists from the perspective of the people who will be using them and care about them? Again, what are the suitable form factors and embodiments? What are those acceptable accuracy rates? Like what, many AI and machine learning researchers might be targeting, 85% accurate is like the benchmark. But why? Why that number? Is that good enough for this situation? In what cases? How do we deal with errors? Those sorts of things. And so kind of answering some of those questions is what we're looking at. I'm a very mixed methods researcher, and so we're throwing the kitchen sink in terms of methods at this problem. We've got 5 years to kind of engage with this work, but we've been doing a lot of work with a method called asynchronous remote communities. So this is bringing a community of practitioners onto asynchronous remote community platforms, which you might be familiar with, like Slack or Teams or Discord, these kind of online communities where you can have these kind of rich interactions. So what we do is we bring a whole bunch of people onto Slack, for example, and bring them here for over time, and we ask them questions, and they serve as almost design consultants throughout the length of the project. So we've formed an asynchronous remote community with parents and speech-language pathologists who are sort of serving as our design consultants throughout the work. We're doing interviews, focus groups, surveys, your kind of bread and butter of human-centered design work. Also going to be working on doing co-design activities with speech-language pathologists and in the future children, and I'll explain why we haven't done children yet in a moment. And then eventually throughout the 5 years, we're going to be developing technology probes. Like what are some of the ideas for some of the technologies that we have? Can we build functional or semi-functional prototypes and test those in realistic environments to get feedback on those tools? So I'm going to be talking about 3 distinct interventions. So again, we're only about 1.5 years into this 5-year project. So I'm going to be talking about 3 studies that my students and postdoc have been conducting in the last year or so. And we have papers written up. The first one is a published paper at the Chi Work Conference, so specifically thinking about human-computer interaction to support different workplaces. And then 2 are currently under review. So you're getting late-breaking results from us as well. So, all right, I'm going to dig into the first one. Any quick questions real quick before I move on to some of the investigations? Yeah? Yeah, so great question. This is a research grant, meaning that the goal is to develop new knowledge. And this has actually been a really interesting conversation amongst the team because I had to kind of inform the folks on the speech, language, and education side that like, hey, developing this AI screener and AI orchestrator and like getting it into the hands and into a system that's like completely deployable and bug-free and tested is going to take a lot longer than the 5 years that we have. And so we're talking prototypes, we're thinking about design concepts, we're thinking about doing some of these things, but yeah, beyond that, the like actual like making something into a commercial and deployable product is definitely something that would be a little bit beyond the scope. Although we're having some conversations, there's some great folks in like the startup world that are doing some kind of similar work that we're trying to develop some partnerships so we can kind of get some of this knowledge that we're developing through the research out into products right away. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you said for the orchestrator part, like connecting content and Netflix releases similar things, or like competitor-ish?
No, it's not a competitor, right? The types of interventions we're talking about are things that a speech-language pathologist might be delivering. It might be a game. It might be an in-person interaction. It's sort of more like kind of content delivery. Not necessarily. It could be video content, but it's not necessarily video content. So yeah.
Is there a chance to partner with Netflix?
I don't know that Netflix would necessarily be in the same space of what we're working with, but it's kind of just more of a metaphor in terms of that. But yeah, good question. So, yeah.
I was just curious, 5 years is a long time.
Yeah.
And obviously the pace of AI is rapid. So how do you manage, AI not outpacing the work that you're doing to develop new models?
Such a good question. And the funny thing is when we had to submit, so it was a pretty rigorous process to kind of, we had to submit this 125-page plus proposal to the National Science Foundation. It went under the rigorous peer review. We had to go through reviews. So funny enough, large language models does not appear anywhere in our application. That's how quickly things have changed. And so that's all what people are talking about now because of since the release of ChatGPT and all these other large language models. Yes, so we're definitely having to kind of, it's a little bit of an arms race in that way where new technology is kind of coming out in every way, shape, and form. And so a little bit is taking, with researchers, we're able to kind of take a more high level or generalized view about like, things like accuracy and prediction and, automated speech recognition, natural language processing, and so these high level concepts, and then the tools are kind of getting better within them. And so some of the people on the team are actually working to develop some of these very tools as well too. So they're 5 years out from kind of what industry and are aware of what's coming down the pipeline as well too. So that is helpful as well too to have some of the people who are doing that. Yeah.
So that you're including like doctors, SLPs in the design process. Do you have any plans to include like educators?
Yes. Absolutely, yeah. So we're starting primarily with speech-language pathologists because the goal is to kind of expand their reach and being able to work with that. But yes, we're working with parents, we're working with younger kids. The kids are a little bit younger that we're usually targeting in this point. And so we do, my team and my research lab has been working on some great co-design methods for working with younger kids. Unfortunately, the complicatedness of this entire program, we have to get ethics board approval. And to get ethics board approval to work with children is a little bit of a lengthy process. And the National Science Foundation has a regulation that we have to have a single site IRB that covers all of the work of all 12 institutions. And so that is waiting on that approval to be able to work directly with children. But yes, but also thinking around, we've also been trying to work with adults who had speech delays as a kid and sort of hearing from them about what are the experiences they had growing up and sort of how could that have been made better. And yes, that's very much educators, especially kind of on the screening side, because it's going to be general educators who are doing that. And that also the speech-language pathologists work with teachers in classrooms as well, too, to make sure that they're working on learning goals and individualized education plans and things. So yeah. And we're actually not really working with doctors as much. So speech-language pathologists are professionals, but they're not MDs in that way. So usually it's more on the education side of things and less on the medical side. Yeah. All right, I'm going to move on because there'll be more time for questions. Probably we'll have, some of these may get answered as I go through some of our studies, but we'll definitely have some more time for questions at the end. Okay, I did set a timer too because I want to make sure we have time for questions. Okay, so the first study I'm going to talk about is just we wanted to hear from speech-language pathologists about what do they think about AI and how can it fit into their practices. What are the things that they love about their jobs that we want to make sure that AI is not replacing, and what are the things that are frustrating and annoying about their job that they would love to outsource to AI? So that's kind of the overarching question that we started with in this particular work. So we did a mixed method study, kind of just with this overarching question of all the different ways that we could reach SLPs. So we did a survey with 105 speech-language pathologists, recruited broadly through our network. We went to the ASHA mailing list, put them in newsletters, did word of mouth, sent them out to schools, all the sorts of things that you might want to do to reach this population. We invited a subset of them of the survey participants onto this asynchronous remote community on Slack that I told you about, so 12 participants, and we had those participants do a variety of design activities like diary methods. We did them doing kind of co-design activities, responding to different scenarios. We had them explore things like ChatGPT and give us some feedback about what they thought about the experience there. And then we did a little bit of social listening, which is one of my favorite activities too, because as you mentioned, like AI was exploding right around this time we were doing this work, and so we wanted to hear what people were talking about. So we went and found there's a SLP subreddit on Reddit. There's a private Facebook group for SLPs, and then there's also specifically one on SLPs using AI in their work, which is really cool. So we got permission from the moderators to come in and observe the kinds of conversations that people are having online. And then we also were reviewing articles about AIs for SLPs. So someone already self-published a book using AI for speech-language pathology. So really thinking about what was going on in the online community as we were witnessing the explosion of AI in this space. So we had kind of 4 overarching research questions. So again, what are the needs, constraints, and challenges they're currently facing in their work? What are their current perspectives on AI? Are they worried about it? Are they afraid it's going to replace them? Are they worried it's going to lower the quality of care? Or are they excited about it? Are they early adopters? Are they excited for the possibilities of what it could do? How are those early adopters actually doing things? Are they using ChatGPT or DALL-E or other sorts of off-the-shelf tools already in their practice? And we were definitely seeing some of that. And then again, sort of thinking about this space of ideation. So what are the different possibilities and ways that we might be able to think about AI-based tools that might increase their capacity to help more kids and improve their job satisfaction overall? So kind of go into some of the findings. I'm going to go through it a little bit quickly just so we can have time for conversation because you all have really good questions. I want to make sure we have time for that. So just some of the findings. So time management and availability, we already knew this, right, going in, that that's why the whole institute exists, is that many of the caseloads for SLPs are overwhelming. They have a lot going on. And there's just administrative and paperwork challenges. After every session they have with a kid, they have to write these copious documentation notes after the fact. They have to submit for billing and insurance. They have to think about coordinating and scheduling. There's kind of a lot of administrative work that they're doing. And sort of thinking through, especially now in the pandemic, speech-language pathology work has also become hybrid like we all have, and sort of thinking about their schedule. Sometimes they might go to a kid's house, sometimes they might be in a school, sometimes they might be online. And it's kind of a whole traveling salesman problem around how do you sort of schedule in an efficient way to make sure you're not spending all your time commuting and going from place to place. And so a lot of the things like that are some of the biggest challenges that they're facing. There's a lot of interest in technology. So the main thing that we saw on the left is curiosity. This is all descriptive data, so there's no kind of stats on here. And they could choose, we asked in the survey kind of, what do they feel about AI? And they could check as many boxes as possible. But most of them were curious. They see promise in AI. We have a little bit of selection bias because our criteria is hey, if you're interested in discussing AI and speech-language pathology, fill out our survey. So there's a little bit of selection bias here. So the majority of the people who came here wanted to kind of give us their thoughts on it. Only about half of them had played with AI tools at the time of the survey, and this was already about 1.5 years ago, so I suspect this number has probably gone up quite a bit. But then a number of them, a good third of them, were worried about AI's impact, right? So they see this exploding on the scene, and they don't know what's going on or how it's going to impact their practice, so they're a bit worried about it, or they're not sure. Very few people were actually neutral, though, so everybody had an opinion at least. But we asked them sort of the reason for why they're interested in engaging this work, and so some of the quotes there: "I'd love to be part of the shift in our field to hopefully automate some of the paperwork that is time-consuming." So they were already seeing some of the potential for some of this administrative work that was very annoying that they had to deal with, and AI's potential for that. Definitely some concerns and considerations. So many of them already struggle to keep up with technology. There's always new things coming out, new educational technologies. If you go to the App Store, there's a bajillion different things, and they're already having trouble sort of sorting through what's high quality, what's evidence-based. And so yes, this is yet another thing that I have to learn and keep on top of. So this kind of need for keeping up on technology tools there was interest, but not necessarily time to kind of take the time to learn and to use those things. So, and then some people are kind of old school, right? I try to avoid technology as much as possible because they really believe in sort of the value of face-to-face interaction with kids. And schools resist technology in a lot of ways for a lot of good reasons, and there were definitely some people who felt that. Definitely privacy concerns. Are these things HIPAA compliant, FERPA compliant? So if you're less familiar with the laws in the United States, there's, because we're sort of in this hybrid between both the kind of medical side and the educational side, there's two different privacy laws that apply. HIPAA is for the medical side, and FERPA is for the educational side. And so, the intersection of those two is okay, but there's definitely differences between the two, and already keeping up on top of these. And if you read the privacy policies for ChatGPT and OpenAI, they're using data that's coming from all sorts of places, and they don't always know if they can be. And you might have heard your own network saying don't put your personal information in there. They're going to retrain it on other things, and so there's definitely some concerns about privacy around AI. But they did see some potential for positive change. One of our Asynchronous Remote Communities participants who we had play with ChatGPT, she'd originally been hesitant to use it for her personal use, but then we had her actually try it. We gave them an account that they could use. They didn't have to use their own personal account, so if anybody was kind of leery about signing up for an account, they could use ours. And it was kind of eye-opening. Like many of us, maybe the first time we used an LLM, you're surprised by what it can do, right? You're like, oh my gosh, write a poem about such and such, and it writes this really long, 8-stanza poem about something really interesting. And so that was our first time sort of playing with that for some of those things. And so they could kind of see this as being used in a great way for thinking about generating materials for therapy. So one of the quotes from one of our collaborators on the team, on the AI Institute team, says you'll never see an SLP not carrying a backpack and tote bag full of many, many things. And so they walk around with books and flashcards and reading materials, and they just have tons and tons of these materials because they're trying to get kids to pronounce different words or recognize different sounds, and they have flashcards with visuals and text-based things, and so they're carrying backpacks and backpacks full of these materials around to everywhere they go. And so they see some potential for thinking about AI to sort of play with some of those materials. And so, again, on the therapy trail, they thought that the AI had a potential to personalize some of that. So, a lot of these materials that they're developing, these stories, these flashcards, these images, are all really generic, like clip art, clip art style, cartoony style. Many of them are not representative of the different cultures of the students that they're working with. And so they saw this idea that maybe we could use AI to think about how we might customize some of these things. Or maybe you have a 6-year-old who's struggling to pronounce some things, and you have this really dry story about the kid losing its stuffed dog on an airplane. But what that kid really loves is Pikachu, right? So could you sort of use AI-based or language learning models to take this sort of story that they're trying to practice and make it about something that the kid really loves, and sort of customize it and tailor it to their interest to make it a little bit more engaging instead of this drier material. So they definitely saw some opportunities there. And so we saw some of this on the social listening. So some of the folks on Reddit were sort of using things like DALL-E to make custom stimuli, what they call those images, for their students in this practice. We also saw that people had been using AI to translate materials as well too. So if they had a student or family that they were working with that spoke Spanish and they didn't speak Spanish, they were using it. And my next study I'm going to talk about is going to talk about if you're thinking about, how do they know it's right? That was the next question that we came up with that we want to study next. So that'll be the next study. So keep that thought in mind because we'll get back to it. They definitely really, really wanted AI to help with documentation. So they write these things called SOAP notes at the end of every one that sort of talks about okay, what did they work on? How do they do? What do we need to do for next time? And this gets documented. So if you've ever been to you visit your doctor and you have your patient notes and things like that, and they kind of now they're putting them in patient portals. It's sort of similar that they have to do this documentation after every meeting, and so but these are really tedious, right? It's what are the drag? Every job has the component of you that you really feel is a drag, and for them writing these documentation notes was really the drag, and so they would love some support and sort of helping to generate these notes after the fact in these documentations. So. They also thought it was great to sort of think about how to create, tweak, and share resources with each other. So, SLPs often work, sometimes they work in school settings, but they may be the only SLP working in that school setting. or they're in private practice and they're the only one kind of working alone. And they may go to like the ASHA conference every year and meet with other SLPs, or they might attend like professional development training things, but often they're kind of isolated. And so they thought that this could be a great way to also kind of share resources with each other and sort of create some things. So some people had ideas around creating, custom databases for things like a chat that you could chat with to kind of get support or feedback from other SLPs that were trained by other SLPs, or helping with writing out goals for their kids to be working on and things like that. And then, thinking about sharing tips with other SLPs. So, what prompts can they use to get, the prompt engineering part of working with large language models. So they were, kind of sharing tips and things with each other, and on some of the Reddits, the subreddit and the Facebook groups, people were sort of sharing, if you pretend that you're a speech-language pathologist, then you can get them to kind of respond when you want. So they're kind of using the tools in that way. And then, the administrative work, things like progress reports, documentation, thinking about the aspect of like note taking and like keeping track of everything that happened in the session, because they have to take notes while they're doing these things, but they want to be spending time with the kids. That's what they felt most meaningful. So if they could offload some of that administrative work, then that would be really great. Session preparation and planning, sort of thinking about, and this is kind of maybe getting into the AI orchestrator piece a little bit, like what does this kid need? Where are they at? Maybe they visit them with them once a week and they have to remind themselves, okay, I have 20 kids in my caseload that I've seen since I've seen this kid. Where was I at? What are they working on? Do I have to which materials do I need? Which things in my backpack, my tote bag of things do I need to make sure I have before I see this kid again? So all that session planning and preparation that they thought AI could potentially assist with that as well too. Thinking about care coordination, so generating reports that they have their kind of clinical notes, their SOAP notes, so they call them, that they have to prepare for their clinical work, and then they have to have their individualized education plans with the schools or with the teachers, but then they have to also communicate with parents as well too. So there's this whole kind of community of care around the child, and that child, depending on their needs, might also be getting things like physical therapy or occupational therapy or other sorts of services. And so coordinating in that whole team was also an opportunity that they saw. So thinking about scheduling algorithms to make sure they can think about like making sure an efficient process is happening for scheduling, or thinking about care coordination, or sending emails or text messages just to update the parent about what's going on. Or if they have to reschedule someone because one kid's sick, then it can just push a button and like send a message to kind of text with the parents, because different parents prefer different types of communication strategies, and so it'd be great to remember that this kid's parents wanted this type of text messaging tool, and this kid's parents prefer email, and you just said reschedule this kid, and it kind of takes care of some of that for them. I won't go into this, but billing and insurance management seems like a huge nightmare for anybody dealing with it. If you've ever had to deal with your own insurance company or anything, you could probably resonate with this, so I'm not going to go into too much detail of this. So that's kind of the findings. So lots of different ideas and opportunities and some hesitations and things. And then also want to make sure that we kind of address some of the ethical considerations around this work as well too. So as we all know, and kind of I alluded to before, there's a lot of bias in speech recognition as well as AI in general. And so there's a lot of interest in sort of using speech recognition to listen to maybe sessions with kids. And a lot of interest in using speech recognition or automated speech recognition for the screening component. But we know that the AI is only as good as the data it's trained on, and we know that the data that's trained on is likely biased and not necessarily representative of the types of kids that are in the system. So you can also imagine most of these are trained on adults and not children. If any of you have kids and you've had them try to get your Siri or your Alexa to listen to them, they don't always respond as well as they might to adults because they haven't necessarily been trained on kids. Also things, they're likely going to be biased in certain ways. They're going to be probably white biased or ability biased or American biased in many of these ways. And so there's definitely some considerations for that, which we took a deeper dive into in the next study that I'll talk a little bit about. So thinking about how we'd incorporate fairness constraints in this work was a big thing to think through. Prioritizing responsible AI deployment, and so you're thinking about the transparency, accountability, and privacy concerns in AI. A lot of the SLPs have been concerned about putting any child data into a system to train it, let alone sort of customizing some of those things. And there's definitely some techniques you can do, placeholders instead of the kid's name and other sorts of things that you can kind of do, but they have to know how to do that, and they have to know to do that in the first place. So sort of thinking about, can we by default make sure that they're not sort of, sharing personal information in these systems? Making sure we're conducting privacy assessments, making sure they're protecting data that might be subject to FERPA and HIPAA and all those sorts of things. And then thinking about what is the source of the data that these things are trained on, were all sort of questions that we wanted to make sure came up. That they apply to any AI system, but they also apply in some specific ways to this space as well. Other things is that, and this is pretty much the rule, people are seeing, AI replacing artists. That's not what we wanted, right? We didn't want AI to come and replace the artists of the world. We want them to do the mundane, boring jobs. Same thing with SLPs. It's actually a job that has a lot of job satisfaction. These are professional, educated employees who really love working with kids and love seeing the difference that they can make in these kids' lives, and proposing to replace any aspects of those jobs that they really find meaningful would be a bad use of AI. But those things that they find a drag, the documentation, the scheduling, the paperwork, the billing, all those sorts of things are what we should be targeting, not replacing the job of the SLP. And then, making sure that the outputs are generated are explainable and interpretable, which is a huge problem with most AI systems as well. So any questions on that one? I'm going to dig deep, but you probably have some interest in the bias piece, so I could kind of dig into that, and I might bring up some questions there. But any kind of quick questions on that particular study? Yes?
I was just wondering, if you can explain in more detail, how is the success of these models being kind of interpreted in real life setting?
Good question. So how's this? It depends on what they're using it for, right? So some of the SLPs were sort of using things like ChatGPT or Bard at the time, now it's Gemini, to generate materials for their, they might say, generate a story that uses the D, the T and the D phonemes in speech. And so they might do that, but then they can kind of look at the output and say, yeah, it did a pretty good job, or oh no, it completely got it wrong. So they're kind of doing a manual assessment of kind of the output of depending on what they're asking it for. So it's kind of an iterative process where they'll say, no, that's not what I meant. So they're kind of manually checking the output of these large language models or the images that get generated. That was, you'll see in some of that case that the image generation was definitely they could look at it, the image, and be like, no, that's not at all what I was thinking of at all. And so they're kind of this manual assessment for how well the output that they work. But some of it depends on the prompt engineering too. So maybe the system's okay, but they didn't ask it in the way that the system understood, right? So it's definitely an iterative process. And so, but kind of just accuracy, representativeness, correctness are some of the things that they were kind of assessing it for. Yeah, good question. Okay, I think I'm going to dig into the next study, which is exploring AI-based support in speech-language pathology for culturally and linguistically diverse children. And so, to kind of set a preface with this, speech-language pathologists are wonderful people, but they are 95% in the United States, 95% white women. And so there's not a lot of, and so I didn't have any demographic information in there because it literally was, our SLP survey was 95% white women because it matched the national demographics of speech-language pathologists. So it's a highly educated, but it requires, full master's degree, and it's a caring field, so it has, very heavily skews towards women. But the kids that they're serving are not necessarily white women, right, or white and girls, right? So there's a huge range of kids that they're supporting. And the speech-language pathologists know this. They know that they don't necessarily have the cultural expertise, the language match of the kids that they're working with, and they know that this is a concern. And so they wanted to see if they could use AI in a way to support them in helping their kids who are from more culturally diverse or linguistically diverse backgrounds. And so by linguistically diverse, we mean things like, culturally could be, maybe, immigrants who English isn't their first language and they've come to the US and they're learning a new language. But it could also mean, students with dialects, right? Kids from Southern Black communities who speak AAVE or African American Vernacular English, which is a perfectly wonderful and valid form of expression, but is not common enough that these systems are actually good at picking them up. And so they know these sorts of things, and they know that sometimes when someone says that someone might have a speech delay, it might actually just be a linguistic difference or something that's a result of them being learning a second language. And so wanting to make sure that they're doing a good job of assessing whether or not the kid is actually truly behind or delayed in some way, or if it's just a linguistic difference or diversity that is just not being accounted for in these things. Yes?
Just a quick question. Are these all, is the N just people in America or outside?
For our studies? Yeah, we primarily, so this is funded by two US-based government organizations, and so we're primarily focusing on this in the US, but speech-language pathologists exist and serve people all over the US. And so, but that 95% white women demographic is for the United States in particular. So, but yeah, good question. So anyway, we wanted to dig more deeply into this idea of using AI-based tools to create materials that were more adapted to different cultures or languages, or as we saw in the previous study, that they were using them for things like translation and things like that. And so we got started in this study by doing a fun experiment. So my postdoc, Haewon, hi Haewon, she's from Korea, and my student Ayushi is from Nepal. And so we did it, we were just like, let's go to ChatGPT and say, like, we took a story that was about a kid lost his dog on the plane. And there's like a little short story that was used as a kind of a standard material for a speech-language pathologist. So he went to ChatGPT, it's like, okay, modify this story to make it relevant for a kid from a Spanish-speaking background. So we went there and ChatGPT did its thing. And we're like, oh, it's not bad, you know? It said like what it modified, it used like a different word for dog and like what they call the mom. They explained, to ChatGPT's credit, it explained how it did the modification after it gave it. It was like, it's not bad. And then we're like, let's do it for Korean. And then Haewon's like, oh no, that's so bad. It's not good at all. But it did the same thing. It explained to us, so none of us in the room had a Spanish-speaking background, so we all thought it was good. And then as soon as Haewon saw the Korean version, she saw how bad it was. We're like, oh, okay, let's try it for Nepal. Same thing. Ayushi's like, no, that's not right at all, right? And so what we realize is that if these speech-language pathologists are sort of seeing this, that seems credible that what the large language models are doing in generating these images and these things, because from their perspective, they don't know any better. But when you have someone from that culture assess it, then they realize it's not good. Same thing like if you've ever tried to use large language models in any way, write a story about honeybees, which unless you're like a beekeeper, you probably don't know much about it. It sounds totally plausible. But if you're a super nerd about Star Wars and you have it write a story, you see all the ways it gets wrong, and you know that if it's something you know about, it's wrong. And so it's sort of similar things in this were happening with the sort of adaptation of materials for different cultures. Again, so AI holds great potential to sort of like make customized materials or other sorts of things, and addressing some of this kind of material generation that speech-language pathologists might want to use. But that, as we all know, AI lacks huge gaps in cultural, linguistic, and disability-related considerations. So we want to kind of explore this. I don't have time to do this justice, so I'm going to point you to Alea, Lewis, and Haewon, and Ayushi, who led some of this work. But we're really interested in looking at the current experiences of SLPs in supporting their culturally, linguistically, and disability students with disabilities and building that into their practice. Again, what are the opportunities, and what does current kind of off the shelf? We always have to list like what model we're using because we can't say current anymore because it's always changing. And addressing these challenges. So we basically embarked on a study to kind of explore this thing that we had identified in our research meetings. Basically we combined semi-structured interviews and surveys with speech-language pathologists. Specifically we recruited SLPs who were working with culturally and linguistically diverse children in their practices. So conducted interviews with them, and then we did a series of studies where we had them generate some prompts and materials using ChatGPT and DALL-E to generate images and text for the types of materials they'd like to see, and then they were going to assess how well they did and what kinds of things happened. And we also specifically prompted them to think about just generate the text as you think about it, and then adapt it for the cultural and linguistic diversity that you're hoping to see. So I don't have a ton of time to go on all the findings because we're getting close on time, but lots of things, unrepresentative materials. If you just put, generate a photo of children in a classroom who are listening to a teacher, like most of the kids in that classroom are actually white. And most of it looks like a very Americanized classroom with desks and things along those lines. The things on the wall are very, even without any prompting. But then if you add it to sort of say, add some cultural diversity, then they go straight towards the stereotypes, right? They find like if you say like adapt these materials for someone in Nepal, for example, they might take the most like, stereotypic things and put them into these scenes as well too. So definitely unrepresented materials, and there's unreliable and inefficient translation. So that's why we were a little worried when we saw the comment from the Reddit user that said, "Oh yeah, I just plugged things into Spanish, and had it translate to Spanish, and it was great," right? Because they didn't know that it was not as well. They didn't know that it didn't work as well. And then so then a lot of materials were also concerned about thinking about this cultural and linguistic diversity as well too. So again, like AAVE or Southern English or other sorts of dialects, and making sure that those are represented in these materials. So the SLPs are often spending hours analyzing responses to see if they're consistent with the patterns of this, the different dialects they're looking at. Other things, so these are they wanted to do the representative material generation, translation, thinking about these language variations and thinking about these, how we can, so this one says, I think the biggest breakthrough is an assessment tool to pick up on the different pronunciations and different language forms are appropriate for different dialects. So kind of neat, they recognize that they need support and they're interested in AI to do this, but they know about the limitations. For the surveys where we actually had them generate some materials and give us their thoughts on it, we found lots of bias happening. So again, cultural bias, most of the stories and images that were generated were white presenting characters with Eurocentric aesthetics. There's a lot of disability bias, so showing able-bodied people defaulting to specific things or incorrect depictions. So this was a participant asked for a disabled child using an augmented and alternative communication device, or an AAC. So again, white-centric, looks like it has Down syndrome, but kind of is a little bit exaggerated. And it's using a tablet-based tool, but you'll notice the tool is backwards. The kid is not looking at the screen is showing out, and the kid is not actually using it, right? So there's these errors about using these kind of assistive technology devices that were completely wrong. And so they were well, that's, they wanted to kind of model how a kid might use this in a classroom, and they're completely wrong in how they're being depicted. And so, but then also this linguistic bias. So if they were having it generate stories or other sorts of things, again, standard English, not a lot of the interesting, or diverse dialects that the kids and their practices were interested in learning about or reading. So definitely some implications. So with enough practice, the SLPs were able to kind of prompt engineer enough to sort of get some materials and adapt them in a way. But in the end, it was almost just as much work to do that as it was to just take the materials and do it themselves. So there's sort of this trade-offs between getting it right versus saving time, right? And so if they want to save time and they put it into ChatGPT and they try to do it, they have to spend all this time making sure they get it right. So there's these kind of trade-offs there. And again, cross-checking that work against making sure that they're checking in with the kids. You're like, hey, is this the word that you use for mom? Is this right here? And kind of cross-check. Again, that's in conflict of saving time. And then sort of, the definite trade-off, accuracy versus transparency and explainability. So the more these algorithms are accurate, the less transparency they tend to have. And then there's some design recommendations as well there. But I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'm going to try and quickly go through some of these things. I'm going to have time to go through all this, but Ayushi's here and she led the study. But we also worked with parents to think about how AI could potentially support home practice. And so one of the challenges of speech-language pathology is kids learn things with their speech-language therapist or their SLP, and they're supposed to practice those throughout the week and in their everyday lives to be able to kind of reinforce the material, and that is a really hard thing to do. And so we were interested in exploring how AI supports could work with home-based practice. So I'm going to just share a little bit, kind of already did that, thinking about, and this is where we started to get into some of the design space as well too. So we worked with, did semi-structured interviews, storyboarding and design concepts. We did some member checking and kind of checked those tools with, or the ideas with the population, and then work with some SLPs to get some feedback. These are some of the examples. one of our wonderful master students in HCDE, helped to develop these storyboards, as well as Cecilia. And so she took the ideas that the parents were generating in her interviews and turned them into really wonderful storyboards and design ideas. And then we went back to the parents to kind of, hey, did we get it right? And then we went back to SLPs to get their feedback on these things. So we had some ideas for some AR-based things to kind of show, if you're trying to pronounce a word correctly, sometimes you need a model of the mouth. And so could you sort of model in real life what this might look like? Thinking about practice and planning. When can we do this throughout the day? Prompting parents, reminding them to kind of do this throughout the day. So again, I will put this up here for the video. So if you want to go watch the video and pause and read some of this on your own, you can. But I know we're kind of out of time, and I want to stick around for questions. But just some overall implications. We're just getting started in this work. So we've kind of done a lot of the formative work, and now we're in the point where we want to kind of build some of these ideas. So shared some of those storyboards and design ideas. We'd love to see some of those put into practice. We're having some conversations about like what prototypes you want to go forward with next in this work. And also communicating this back to the technologists on the team about what they're working on to help guide them towards you. Don't just make it accurate for the different types of kids that we want to try and support in these systems, and make sure that they're reducing bias, making sure that they're transparent and everything that we hope that AI systems can be. So just some next steps, and we want to engage more children. Now we finally have the IRB approval to do that. So we've got some studies where we're actually bringing the kids involved as well and helping them in the code design process, which I'm really glad to finally be able to do. The bureaucracy of that was a little longer than we were anticipating, so we're bringing kids in, doing some code design work with them. Thinking about what does this mean for AI screeners and the AI orchestrator, and then thinking about some of those other questions that we had. So. With that, I always have to acknowledge our funders. They gave us money to do this work and continue to give us money. We are at time, so if you do have to go, happy to have you head out, but I'm also happy around to stick around and answer your questions as well, too. So thank you. Sorry it was so fast. Yeah, I know it's a lot, so happy to answer any questions that you have. And if you want to know more, I can share our 3 papers as well. So if people are interested in any of those things and want to know more, then happy to do that as well. But yeah.